Hi, we enter into Luke 12 today, and there are a number of things we have to do before we enter into the depth of this long but fascinating chapter. And a couple of things we need to do is see how it fits both with what went before it in chapter 11 and also how it fits together as a unit. Because many scholars, whether those in commentaries or in more recent scholarly articles, tend to just assume, without much argument, that chapter 12 consists of a series of disconnected things that are only loosely put together. In fact, a couple of scholars have referred to what Luke's doing here not as composition, but as simply arranging materials. And I want to take strong issue with both those claims. First of all, the question of composition versus arranging materials is based on a whole series of assumptions rather than acknowledging we can't know what Luke was doing specifically. But we do know, as I've been trying to show throughout this series, that Luke changes what he's received from Mark or Matthew, sometimes we can call it Q in the tradition, and he also uses quite a bit of unique vocabulary, including a lot of complex words that the other gospel writers don't do, to highlight that in fact he is clearly composing. He's not making up completely from scratch, but he's using not only editorial decisions to decide what goes where, but rewriting things and writing things anew. Several stories, as we've seen already and more we'll see, are unique to Luke and have no trace from any other source. So Luke is clearly composing, and I'd like to suggest he's composing a very tightly connected narrative, just as we saw last time in chapter 11. As we saw at the beginning of chapter 11, I've suggested this thread that starts with the Lord's Prayer and then goes one of two directions. The blue side is people responding out of the concern that we saw that God doesn't really care about someone like me, or if God is listening, how do I really know it's God's voice from other voices? And then it concludes with once one hears and sees what God wants, total commitment is required. And we saw the single eye versus the evil eye, and that'll be exactly the theme today. On the other side were those who refuse to pray or listen to God, and that leads to collective judgment. Or as we saw with the Pharisees, will be important for today's passage, that doing without listening first, which is to say tithing without neglecting justice and love. And so there, just as there was a pattern in chapter 11, I'd like to say there's a pattern in chapter 12 that takes off right from chapter 11. So before we look at this thematic map, let's just look briefly here at all the various links there are between chapters 11 and 12. And obviously, the Pharisees at the beginning, as you can see on the left side of the screen in verse 1, is one of the first ones. They're mentioned here, but not anywhere else. And what you can see from my list of comparisons is although Luke condenses the story that we saw earlier in Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees in chapter 11 to the metaphor of their yeast and then explaining plainly their hypocrisy, that's plainly what we saw in chapter 11, where they say one thing and do another. We'll look more closely at the word hypocrisy in the Greek in a minute. So a number of connections between chapter 11 and 12, and I'd like to walk through this briefly to see how chapter 12 is also tightly connected, not only to itself, but to chapter 11. So in the connection at the very top here in the blue, I've written here, as you can see, once one hears and sees what God wants via prayer, which is what chapter 11 is about, total commitment is required. And so that's the ending of it. And now we begin with the idea that authentic prayer, which we'll begin with here, provides apocalyptic eyes through which one can see both Rome/Satan's misrule on earth and God's rule in the heaven and the sky. And if acted upon, this will generate conflict with empire and its supporters. And that will be the primary theme that goes through this. And to frame that another way, if one truly is seeking God's will, one will see through those apocalyptic eyes the sharp contrast between what I call the religion of empire and the religion of creation, which is to say Jesus is on the side of the religion of creation with its call for sharing and openness and inclusion and compassion and everybody being in the level place, versus the way of empire, which is hierarchical and dominating, and in the Roman world means the patronage system links those above with those below, and it's all held together with violence, etc. So once one sees that, there's no reason to remain loyal to the bad way, other than for fear and anxiety of what the consequences might be, and that's exactly the themes that we see in chapter 12. So let's look at that, and what follows that initial bifurcation there in the apocalyptic imagery is the question of fearing one who has authority to cast them into Gehenna. And we'll look at that next video, but it's amazing how almost all scholars I've seen, actually all scholars I've seen, assume that means God, and I'd like to suggest it's not God at all. In fact, that would be completely inconsistent with Luke's portrayal of God throughout, so we'll have to look at that next time. But it's highlighting that not to be afraid of God, because God has your back, and as long as one is willing to confess one's allegiance to the human one over empire, God will be with you. And then it follows around the question of justice and and redistribution around the interruption that leads to the story of the rich fool. And we'll look more in detail at that. But Pliny the Rich Fool is an example of someone who isn't following Jesus and has no clue and faces consequences. Then we'll continue with rejecting the benefits of empire will shatter the false security that accompanies imperial allegiance. But again, the Creator provides, so there's no need for anxiety over daily provisions. Which is to say that if one is torn out of one's network of patrons and friends that can provide, as we saw in chapter 11, whether it's a village or otherwise, where people can call in their neighbors to support them, if people perceive that one is unpatriotic, is contrary to the empire, is a traitor, then they're not going to want to associate with you, and you can lose jobs and connections and all kinds of things. So the anxiety over food and clothing is serious. But it's not just an abstraction like me today or you today, just worrying about I don't have enough money, but specifically around the question of breaking one's dependence upon empire and trying to learn how to rely on God alone. And that will continue with the call for disciples to always be awake and ready to serve the human one, which is a warning against slipping back in, as we see in Paul's letter so often, especially in 1 Corinthians, where people had an initial excitement to follow Jesus, but in daily life the consequences of it were just too wearing and too hard, and so they fall asleep and go back into it. It will continue in chapter 12 in the 40s verses around two examples of slavery and different lordships. And we'll see the contrast there, with the difference being that Jesus' lordship does not threaten or use violence to achieve service like Roman lords, to get their slaves to be of service. And so we'll see that contrast as well. And then also, not only will one be cut off from patronage, but cut off within the very family. That allegiance to Jesus and the gospel will divide families, and we'll see there are echoes of that also in chapter 11, as we saw, and also echoes anticipating what we'll see later. And then near the very end, we hear just as engaging in Roman courts and /justice can lead one to debtor's prison if people don't, as retranslating a phrase here from the chapter, give your best work to set yourself free. So those who would become disciples must understand how to discern the kairos, which is to say, how to act in the midst of Roman rule, as if God fully ruled now. And I continued into chapter 13. Many scholars say there's a unit all the way through 13:9, and we may look at that, but it's a little different story. So at least through 13:1 to 5, this leads to repentance, and this is to the crowds. So this is not to people who have already made the commitment, presumably that's the disciples, but to the crowds who were at the beginning gathering by the thousands and trampling one another, plainly not treating each other with kindness and love and compassion, but treating each other as competitors to get close to be able to hear Jesus, as we'll see in an image in a moment. That repentance, which is to say, as we saw back in chapter 3, turning from allegiance to the empire to allegiance to God, is required to prevent one being caught up in the cycle of violence. And so that's what carries us all the way through, and I hope we can continue to follow that so we can see the links here. The key words are interestingly divided into little sections because it's such a long chapter, and although I usually just do key words, which mean words that are used 4 or 5 or 6 or more times, I've also highlighted a couple of elements how this chapter is bounded by 2 phrases at the beginning and the end: hypocrisy and pennies, of all things. And so you see at the end, hypocrisy, hypocrites and pennies. But each scene will have its own key words, as we'll see. So in the beginning, it will be around fear, and then it'll turn to anxiety with the intervention of the rich fool who's all about himself, I. And then the question of anxiety, and we'll see how Jesus compares God to the Creator. Doesn't compare, says God is the Creator, and compares people to birds and flowers in terms of God's provision. And then we'll see in the second half of the chapter, all these blue things, as I noted up here, they're not the same word, but they're time-related, highlighting the urgency involved. And I can go back to the beginning and show those. So at that very hour, falsely for many years, the rich fool falsely imagining he has many years, in contrast, this very night, your span of life, the middle of the night or near dawn, the unexpected hour, the proper time, which is also kairos here, not expect him at an hour he does not know, or a day he doesn't know, and then from now on and the present time. So many elements here that are connecting the urgency to stay awake and the urgency involved here. And we'll see the master-slave keywords later. So those are some of the keywords that Luke uses to frame different sections. And this first section is parallel to a section in Matthew, but as we've been seeing in this section where Luke, in the section of which is to say the journey to Jerusalem, starting in 9:51 in Luke, we're not going to try to decide which was first here between Matthew and Luke, and I'm not going to worry about the Q element, because scholars now are getting to be more divided around the question: are Matthew and Luke both dependent upon some earlier thing called Q, which has never been found, or was Matthew first and Luke is taking from Matthew, which may well be, but I'm not going to get into the arcane arguments around that. All I will note here is that Matthew and Luke have similar passages, but we'll focus on what's not only what's similar, but what's different. The context is already different in the narrative structure. This is chapter 12 and that's chapter 10, which is banal to note, but in the story it's also very different. Notice this one starts in the middle of a conversation, so have no fear of them. Well, here in chapter 12 there's plainly a clear start. Here he's also talking to the disciples, and here there's a crowd, but he began to speak first to the disciples. And the insertion of beware the yeast of the Pharisees here is unique to Luke here. That little phrase is taken from Mark, but when we look at our passage more closely, we'll see how Luke just really extracts it from its Markan context and puts it into here. So all the bold parts of the parts are identical, but as we'll see here, there's something very different here. In Matthew's version, it's what Jesus says that will be that he calls them to tell. What I say to you in the dark, tell in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim. So it's a call to evangelization. Whereas here, it's a call to recognize you won't be able to keep anything secret. Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark will be heard in the light, and what you have whispered from behind closed doors will be proclaimed from the housetops. Or we might say, what you said at home will be posted on Facebook. And so we see the similarity around the sparrows and the counting of the hairs and the confessing, but there's also these differences here. So we'll look at those as we've been going all the way through. So let's put the keywords up and we'll begin to enter into our passage. So the end of chapter 11 had them the Pharisees lying in wait for him to catch him in something he might say. Meanwhile, and a little phrase here, NOI says green notes, linking the following with what has preceded. And I think it's really important to highlight that in addition to all the parallel words and themes that I've shown, there's also this narrative hook that connects them. But then we see this interesting image, when the crowd gathered by the thousands, so they trampled on one another. And you can see from this image, just for a moment, what it might be like to have crowds by the thousands. We've otherwise imagined it's a gathering of disciples. We've seen them counted as many as 70. But crowds by the thousands bring up Monty Python-like images, where how much are people going to be able to hear Jesus? We can talk about the human microphone here, where maybe people in the front proclaim it all in one voice to people in the back, or we can imagine the Monty Python version where it gets changed into Blessed are the Cheesemakers from the Sermon on the Mount from Life of Brian. But let's look more closely at our words here and see exactly what Luke is trying to tell us here. So when the crowd gathered, having been gathered together, as Nolan notes here, an unusual word, only 2 other times in Luke, but by the thousands, using the word myriad here, myriadon here, as Marshall notes, the use of the article with myriadon suggests that the usual crowds are meant, the multitude or the big crowds. It literally means 10,000, but it's also just a big number. And we've been noting the crowds are continuing to grow since 1129. But they're not just a peaceful crowd, they're trampling on one another. It's elsewhere used in the Gospels for trampling on objects like salt or pearls in Matthew, or seeds in Luke. As Tannehill notes below, carries with it the nuance of hatred, maltreatment, and oppression. In other words, this is not a people that seem to be tolerant and welcoming of each other. Something is gravely wrong. And we don't know what that wrong is, but it certainly can seem that these are people desperate to find a way that will liberate them from the Romans, or if we imagine them as partly a Jewish crowd, to wonder whether Jesus might be the Messiah in particular to liberate them from the Romans. But they're not a community, and that's what passages like the feeding in the wilderness are about, to create a community out of the crowd. But that's not what happens here. So trampling on one another here, and one another is often used positively for people talking to one another or eating together, but here it's plainly not. So in that context, he began to speak first to his disciples, as my note below notes, suggesting that this instruction is for those already within the community, as distinguished from those at 12:13, as we'll see. The disciples we last saw perhaps left behind at 11:37. This direct address will continue through 12:8, but maybe through 12:12. The word for beware here is the first of four balanced uses in Luke, two regarding outside concerns, one here and one in chapter 20, and two regarding inside concerns, as we'll see. And let's look at Mark's context to see how different it is. In Mark's context, this is, as we see here, the disciples have forgotten to bring any bread, and they'd only had one loaf, and he says, watch out, and they think it's about bread, and he recalls the two wilderness feedings, and is trying to get them to hear that there's one loaf for both Jews and Gentiles. Our passage here has nothing whatsoever to do with bread or that kind of community. In fact, bread is not mentioned, simply yeast. Beware the yeast of the Pharisees. Yeast in Greek is zume, and as Fitzmyer notes, in Roman religion, the priest of Jupiter, the flamen dialis, was forbidden to touch zume because it comes from corruption and corrupts. And so we should see from this image, it's much closer to what we might think of as sourdough starter, not the kind of powdered yeast you'd get in a bag. It's something that's left over from a previous baking, and it's understood as corruption because it's bubbling, and of course the bubbles is the waste product of the little microorganisms that are causing it. The ancients might not have known about the microorganisms, but they could plainly see and smell what was happening to the flour as it was as the yeast was expanding, so they thought of it as corrupt. So that's the image that's being presented here. But it doesn't leave us with the image or lead us to consider yeast in detail. It simply tells us it's a hypocrisy. As we see from green below, an unfortunate transliteration of a Greek lexeme, the meaning of which in Luke is closely aligned with its use in the Septuagint. There it describes, quote, a person whose conduct is not determined by God and is thus godless. But we need to pay a little closer attention to its root meaning. Hippokritos, literally meaning under the critics, which is to say actors. That in the theater, the critics are above and the actors are below, and so the critics are watching the people below to see how they behave. But what's at issue is precisely what we saw in chapter 11, which is that Jesus criticized the Pharisees for saying one thing and doing another, for having a public persona that doesn't respect who they really are. And that's a temptation here for Jesus' disciples for the opposite reason. If they would hide who they are so that their Roman neighbors would not know they're followers of Jesus. And the temptation to that would be certainly very strong. But this sense of being one person versus another in yourself was so heinous as we understood for people that in the early church, actors could not be baptized because there was a sense that you couldn't trust if they were speaking to you sincerely or not. If they were professional pretenders, or one could even say professional liars, then how do you know if they make a commitment to follow Jesus and to protect everybody in the community from Roman persecution that that's true or not? So the hypocrisy can be people like the Pharisees who want to look good in public but really aren't following God, or Jesus' disciples who are really seeking to follow God but are simply afraid, and that's why fear will be the primary theme coming right up here. And so, having talked about that image, it shifts drastically here. And I want to note here that this verse is almost exactly parallel in 8:17, which we can see here, but the language is different. Here in 12, we see the language of covering up, and in chapter 8, we see more the language of hidden or secret. But it's plainly the same point that we see in both situations. So nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, usually, literally, apocalyptic. That will not be revealed. And that's the point of my saying in the introduction here, having apocalyptic eyes. And we can see this one of two ways, whether they're covering up their discipleship or what the Romans are trying to cover up, which is all the oppression and violence that they cause, that will be revealed through the act of Jesus and his disciples testifying to it. So that can play both ways as well. So nothing that will be covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret, krypton here, not the place that Superman was from, that will not become known. And so given that, Jesus then has a therefore. What we see in verse 3 is expressed as causally related to what we see in verse 2. So the fact that things will be revealed, that there will be an apocalypsis, and again, noting that apocalypse in the Bible and in Greek has nothing to do with its perversion in modern way we speak of it as just a lot of violence or the end of something or turmoil. It literally means revelation, or literally to lift the veil, but a synonym with the English word revelation. So that's what's at issue here. Not the end of the world or violence, but simply the lifting the lid, if you will, the discovering. And that would be a nice translation here, to say discovered, to carry the double meaning of when we discover something, we learn it, but we also take the cover off that kept it hidden. So in verse 3 we hear, and I note below, the blending of visual and oral images, the said, heard, the dark and light, the whispered, proclaimed, the private rooms and the housetops. So therefore, using the little word onth here, meaning for this reason, from the Louanita lexicon, used 4 times, but also connecting with chapter 11, whatever you have said, and notice it's plural here, directed to the group, in the dark, one of the themes that we saw connected with chapter 11, and notice all the images of conspiracy here, the in the dark, whispered, and closed doors. So what is said in the dark will be heard in the light. Whether that means people are spying on you or listening at the door or asking your neighbors or your friends what's happening, it will come out. Literally, it will be heard toward the ear. In the light, and light, of course, is so common throughout. We saw it last time as part of the issue about eyes and having the single eye, which is to say, focus simply on God and not on the empire. And what you have whispered here, or literally spoken to the ear, as the Louanita lexicon notes, an idiom, which is to say there are conversations about the Pharisees' hypocrisy, although it could be more, behind closed doors, or that could be in an inner or private room. We'll see it a little later in the chapter. Curiously, for what ravens don't do is have those. In Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, it refers to the place where Jesus tells people to pray rather than in public. So what you've whispered in the inner room, where you'd hope nobody would hear you and see you, will be proclaimed from the housetops, not by them but by others. And for housetops here, we've seen it we'll see it a couple other times. So that gets us started, and as we'll see as we go through the map, then it will take us to their fear, not of being sent to hell, which is just completely wrong here, but of being cast outside of Jerusalem and having their memory destroyed and being totally dishonored. But we'll have to take a new video to see that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.